Well, remember when the president of France was Donald Trump's new best friend with all those awkwardly long handshakes and pats on the back and strange touching? Well, it sounds like Donald Trump has a new best friend.
Really, he's got a great personality. He's a, funny guy. He's a very smart guy. He's a great negotiator. He loves his people. Not that I'm surprised by that, but he loves his people.
He loves his people. There is a reason that Kim Jong-un is the only overweight person we have ever seen in North Korea, and that is because he is the only person in North Korea who gets to eat as much as he wants, as often as he wants, eat and drink as much as he wants, whenever he wants, whatever he wants, and he starves his people. Starves them. Masses of North Koreans are starving every day and every night, and the President of the United States says the North Korean hereditary dictator loves his people. He loves his people so much that Donald Trump said it twice. Donald Trump has never praised another head of state more fully than he praised Kim Jong-un. President Trump has now said stronger words of praise about Kim Jong-un than he has ever said about even Benjamin Netanyahu. Great personality, funny guy, great negotiator. Kim Jong-un didn't say any of those things about Donald Trump. To get Donald Trump to say all of that, the only thing Kim Jong-un had to do was sign a piece of paper that said he, quote, commits to work toward complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Kim didn't have to say what century that would take place in. He didn't have to say what denuclearization means to him. And so another line of that piece of paper that the president and the dictator signed says that they, quote, commit to hold follow-on negotiations led by the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and a relevant high-level DPRK official at the earliest possible date. Not even a date certain. There isn't even a deadline for their next meeting, and the document doesn't name the North Korean official who Mike Pompeo will be meeting with because, of course, Kim Jong-un just might kill a few North Korean officials between now and then. And so he's not going to name the North Korean official who Mike Pompeo will meet with because he doesn't want to guarantee that any particular North Korean official will not be killed before that meeting. Kim holds power through murder of people around him, including relatives, and by terrorizing his entire country and by starving millions of people. That's the person who Donald Trump now trusts and believes. President Trump said repeatedly that he believes that Kim is going to do everything that the United States wants him to do. We have never seen a more naive and trusting American president in a summit meeting with a foreign leader of any country in history. And we have never seen a president of the United States in a summit meeting with a more vicious leader of any country, a more untrustworthy leader of any country. And this is the leader who Donald Trump trusts and believes and praises more than any other in the world.
The man you met today, Kim Jong-un, as you know, has killed family members, has starved his own people, is responsible for the death of Otto Warmbier. Why are you so comfortable calling him very talented?
Well, he is very talented. Anybody that takes over a situation like he did at 26 years of age and is able to run it and run it tough. I don't say he was nice, or I don't say anything about it. He ran it. Very few people at that age, you can take 1 out of 10,000 probably couldn't do it.
Run it tough. He ran it tough on Otto Warmbier. The President of the United States is actually praising the toughness of a hereditary dictator, a man who inherited his dictatorship and runs it tough through murder and torture and starvation and imprisonment of anyone and everyone he feels threatened by. And so nothing was accomplished at the Singapore summit unless you believe that North Korea's willingness to continue to talk to the Secretary of State is an accomplishment, but North Korea has always been willing to talk to the Secretary of State. And so Mike Pompeo will be the latest Secretary of State to try to get North Korea to give up nuclear weapons. Joining us now is John Heilemann, national affairs analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. He's the co-host and executive producer of Showtime's The Circus. Also with us, Kristof, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the New York Times, who has reported from North Korea multiple times. And James Fallows, Europe editor for The Atlantic, former speechwriter for President Jimmy Carter, and co-author of the new book, Our Towns, a 100,000-mile journey into the heart of America. John Heilemann, he loves his people. President actually went to that point. And this is the same president who made so much of the Otto Warmbier case, a death that he blamed on Kim.
We know the president doesn't know very much about very much. That's been on vivid display throughout his presidency. I think that, and this will not be news to anybody either, when I say that when you watch this performance, you see a moral cipher. Someone who is the guy who came on this network when he was running for president and said that he admired Vladimir Putin's toughness. And when it was pointed out to him that Vladimir Putin had murdered journalists, he said, well, so what? It's better than Barack Obama, who's weak. And, you know, we've killed people, too, in the United States. There was a moral vacuousness to that comment. And there was an abject, kind of horrifying moral vacuousness to everything that happened in Singapore yesterday. It's just one of the most depressing things that I've seen. And I've been pretty depressed during this administration.
Nick, you've been to North Korea multiple times. Your reaction to what happened yesterday?
Well, you know, look, North Korea is not just one more repressive country. It is the most totalitarian country ever. A UN report noted that it has no parallel. The International Bar Association did a report by a concentration camp survivor, a survivor of Auschwitz. He compared the labor camps in North Korea to those that he had survived in. And so
and these labor camps have been going on for decades.
Oh, since the beginning of the country. And about 100,000 political prisoners are sent to them. And what is different? I mean, lots of countries imprison dissidents, but in North Korea, if you are labeled a political prisoner, if you have, for example, a cell phone that can, near the China border area, that can reach into China, if you have a radio with a dial so it can get South Korean broadcasts, then not only are you sent to the camp, but 3 generations of the entire family are sent together. And so this is a country that really does not have a parallel. And what troubled me the most, I think, was not just the silence about human rights, but President Trump seemed to become a defender of North Korea, a spokesman for North Korea. And he referred to military exercises as a great provocation, which is the North Korea position. He said that, yeah, North Korea is a little rough on human rights, but lots of countries are rough. And then in that same VOA interview, he was asked his message to the North Korean people. And he said, he spoke up for Kim Jong-un. He said, yes, he loves his people. We like him, and he's trying to do right by his people. And I just was imagining what happens to somebody who's got family members in those camps, and they're hearing that in this illegal radio in North Korea, and the despair they must feel.
Because let's underline this point. Voice of America radio is pumped into North Korea for the very few people who can hear it, and what the Voice of America wants them to hear is some kind of hope. And what they heard was the President of the United States praising the dictator of their country.
That's exactly right. And the only people who could hear that would be on radios that have been illegally tinkered with to get shortwave broadcasts or to get Chinese stations. And so they are taking an enormous risk, silently listening where nobody can hear them to that broadcast, with the pictures of the great leader and the dear leader staring down at them from the wall that every house must have. And then to hear President Trump commend their leader and say that he loves his people. I mean, what do you say?
And we now have a new breaking news report from North Korea saying that Donald Trump has agreed to lift sanctions on North Korea. That is a claim being made by North Korean state media at this hour, saying Donald Trump agreed to lift sanctions against North Korea, along with providing it with security guarantees. The nation's state news agency has claimed. The Korean news agency also reported that Kim Jong-un had accepted an invitation to visit the White House, said Mr. Trump had indicated he would lift sanctions along with ending military exercises with South Korea. There was no independent confirmation of the claim and no immediate comment from the White House. And James Fallows, the truth of it is, We have no idea what was said in that room by either one of them.
Exactly, because if you benchmark this against normal administrations, you know, a head of state meeting would happen as the last stage because there'd be preparation by staff members and secretaries of state, and these things would be worked out. And at a minimum, there would be aides in the room to hear what one of these people was saying to the other, so we would know that for a fact. And you wouldn't have the President of the United States talking about highly provocative war games, which is what North Korean state media has been saying for decades, and the People's Daily in China. So this is one more sign that just winging it has consequences.
The report also quotes Kim as saying that the North could take additional goodwill measures. And so, John, this was what we were anticipating last night. Two liars go into a room. Two proven liars go into a room, and they are the only sources of what was said in that room. And Kim wasn't going to say this, smart enough to not try to say this publicly while Donald Trump was with him. And so now he says it in North Korea to the North Korean news agency. And what is the President of the United States going to do about this man who he has been praising? Does he now call him a liar, or does he say, yes, and I offered to lift sanctions?
And these are some things that he has already hinted are things he was going to do in the future. At the appropriate time, I'll have him at the White House. It's going to be hard for him to say, well, you know, when I said in the press conference that I would let him come to the White House at an appropriate time, I didn't say now. You know, there's going to be splitting hairs in a situation where there's going to be no proof. All of the things that we're now talking about, some we know to be true, that there are things that Trump says are going to happen related to what are called war games by some. Some now are asserted by the North Korean state media. Tangible things, a trip to the White House, lifting of sanctions, security assurances. These are all tangible things. And what did Donald Trump get for those tangible things? Nothing. Not a single tangible thing. Aspirations, happy talk, things that might happen one day in the future, and the same things North Korea has been saying to successive administrations for the past 30 years. If this, I'd never like to play this game because it is just so shooting fish in a barrel with a big submachine gun, but if Barack Obama had done this,
yes,
the entire Republican Party would be calling for his impeachment tonight.
Well, we can fill the rest of the hour with showing video of Republicans criticizing President Obama for even mentioning the possibility of talking directly to the North Korean leader, including the Republicans who were in the room with Donald Trump yesterday in Singapore, Mike Pompeo, and John Bolton. And so this is clearly one of those instances where they are spinning a complete circle exclusively because Donald Trump is doing it.
That's right. I mean, there are a number of things that we could reasonably have expected to get. It would have been reasonable to have North Korea commit to have no more nuclear tests, no more missile tests. In 1994, they committed to freezing plutonium, to having international inspectors. As recently as 2005, they committed to rejoining the NPT. You know, they could have committed to some kind of verification regime, international inspectors in Yongbyon. And none of that happened, and so one has to sort of assume that they're simply going back to what they originally promised in 1992, which is denuclearization, by which they mean essentially that the U.S. no longer protects South Korea. And in the meantime, you know, we gave up some valuable things. We gave up military exercises. We gave the legitimacy that we confer on Kim Jong-un. We gave the lavish praise that President Trump provided to him. We gave up security guarantees, of which the content is not specifically known. But our great deal maker gave up quite a bit. And as John says, we didn't get anything.
Let's take a look at the motivational video that the President of the United States had made to show to Kim Jong-un, to show him what his future could be. Let's look at this.
Will he shake the hand of peace and enjoy prosperity like he has never seen? A great life or more isolation? Which path will be chosen? Featuring President Donald Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un in a meeting to remake history, to shine in the sun. One moment, one choice. What if? The future remains to be written.
And James Fallows, that looks like a child's presentation to another child to try to convince them to come to the party. And apparently Donald Trump wants to lift sanctions on speedboats. That's why he had that speedboat in the video. But Donald Trump is a true believer in materialism. There's nothing that matters to him more than his stuff. And he thinks that's universal. And he thinks that Kim wants those speedboats for his people.
And he probably wants some for himself. But that video, like so many things about Donald Trump, was unintentionally very revealing, because I agree with John and Nick. The United States got absolutely nothing from this deal and gave up a tremendous amount. Donald Trump got something, at least in the short term, and at least in sort of the theme of that video of being a man of destiny, setting the world's course. So he gave Kim Jong-un, many fold that, but so Trump himself was the only victor with American citizenship from this deal. The rest of us lost.
Nick, quickly, about materialism within North Korea. There is no less materialistic country or population on Earth. The idea that Kim wants to make his people rich strikes me as something that has not yet crossed Kim's mind.
No, I actually disagree with that to some degree. So his father was very much, there was a policy of military first. And Kim Jong-un, when he took over, had a dual policy of military development, but also development of the economy. And so and then recently he took away the military part. Now it's just economic development. And so in Pyongyang, for the elites who are allowed to live in Pyongyang, you have to be an elite to live there. Disabled people are pushed out of Pyongyang, for example. But for those elites, they have opened up nice restaurants, a dolphinarium, an amusement park, and there are these aspirations for the elites who are influential, family members of the regime, that for those, there is some sense that Kim Jong-un would actually like to lift living standards. Long way from having speedboats.
Right.
But dolphinariums.
Dolphinariums.
So speedboats for the elites. Nick Kristof, thank you very much for joining our discussion tonight. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.